"Your mother is dead. What good is crying going to do? Is it going to bring her back? Hurry up and get dinner ready. My friends will be here soon." Those were the first words my husband said to me. It had been exactly 2 hours since I had returned home from my mother's funeral. My husband forced me to cook for his party on the very day she was buried. It all felt like a never-ending nightmare until a man showed up and told my husband, "Everyone who's anyone in this town knows exactly who your mother-in-law was, everyone but you." After that night, everything changed forever. The sound of the car engine cutting off echoed with an unnatural sharpness in the silence of the cold garage. The afternoon sun beat down, as if mocking the gray sky that blanketed my heart. It had only been 2 hours. I had just left Oak Ridge Cemetery, where the cold body of my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, my only family, had become one with the damp, reddish earth. The scent of chrysanthemums and the smell of wet soil seemed to linger in my nostrils, mixing with the salty taste of dried tears on my cheeks. I got out of the car with heavy steps, as if I were wearing shackles on my ankles. All I wanted was to go to my room, lock the door, and hug the pillow she had left me, so I could release the rest of the tears that constricted my chest. But before my hand could touch the front doorknob, the impatient voice of my husband, Mark, shattered the silence. Mark was frowning, glancing at his expensive wristwatch. He didn't look like a man who had just lost his mother-in-law. There was no trace of pain on his face. On the contrary, his eyes shone with a strange mix of excitement and restlessness. He rushed to open the trunk of the car and pulled out several large grocery bags that I didn't know when he had bought. I stood motionless on the porch, staring blankly at the pots with my mother's favorite orchids, which were beginning to wilt from not being watered since the morning. Mark dropped the bags abruptly on the porch floor, and the crash made my head ache even more. He shot me a sharp look, as if urging me to move and wipe that expression of sadness from my face. I tried to ignore his cold attitude and go inside to rest. My body was exhausted. Not only was I physically drained from watching over my mother's body since the previous night, but my soul was in pieces. However, my steps halted when Mark grabbed my arm forcefully. He forced me to turn and face him. His gaze was cold and demanding. He told me I couldn't rest now. In 2 hours, important guests from his company would be arriving at our house. He reminded me that today was the day of the party to celebrate his long-awaited promotion, and he had already invited his entire team, including the department director, to a dinner at our home. Hearing his words, my eyes widened. I was speechless. I couldn't believe my husband could be so cruel. How could he think about parties and celebrations when the earth covering my mother's grave was still fresh? With a hoarse and broken voice, I refused his request. I begged him to cancel the event, or at least move it to another location. I told him this house was in mourning, that I couldn't bear the sound of laughter and loud music while my heart was weeping. I appealed to his conscience, trying to remind him of my mother's kindness during her life, how she had always supported him in difficult times, and how she always gave us part of her modest pension to help us out. But my words only served to unleash his anger. His face turned red. The pressure of his hand on my arm intensified to the point where I felt my bones might break. There, on the porch of our house, he yelled at me in a voice so loud the neighbors could have heard. The words that came out of his mouth were like daggers digging into my open wound. He screamed that my mother was already dead, that there was no use in continuing to cry. He said loudly a phrase I will never forget in my life. Crying wouldn't bring her back. He ordered me to start serving his guests immediately, to prepare the best meal, and not to disappoint them with my funereal face. Mark pushed me, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling against the wall. He threw the grocery bags at me, which contained raw meat, vegetables, spices, and several bottles of wine. Some of the contents spilled out: chicken, vegetables, seasonings, and several bottles of drinks. He gave me an ultimatum. In 2 hours, he wanted every trace of mourning to have disappeared from the house, the table to be filled with delicacies, and me to be presentable to receive the guests. With that, he went into the bathroom, whistling, leaving me collapsed on the porch floor, crying uncontrollably again. With trembling hands, I began to pick up the ingredients one by one. I wanted to run away from that house, to go as far away as possible, but my mother's last words echoed in my ears. She had always told me to be a devoted wife, to keep peace in the home. She always believed Mark was a good man, just going through a rough patch. To honor her memory, I forced myself to stand up. I took all the bags to the kitchen. This kitchen was my mother's favorite place. In that corner, she used to sit and clean scallions while telling me stories of her youth. Now the kitchen felt terribly silent and cold. I started working like a soulless robot. I washed the potatoes with cold water, a cold that chilled me to the bone. My thoughts flew to the moment I had washed my mother's body that very morning. Her cold skin, her peaceful face. My tears fell into the water I was using to wash the vegetables. I wiped my face harshly with my sleeve. I tried to stop the tears, but it was useless. The more I tried to hold them back, the more forcefully they flowed. I started chopping onions and peppers. The pungent smell of the spices irritated my eyes even more, but that stinging was nothing compared to the pain in my chest. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board was like a countdown to the hellish party that was about to begin. Once the kitchen was underway, I went to the living room. Mark wanted the space to look spacious and luxurious. While he was preening in front of the bedroom mirror, I had to move the heavy sofas. Alone. I swept the floor that was already clean, but Mark insisted there was still dust. I mopped the floor with a backache that was splitting me in two. Every time my gaze fell on the photograph of my mother hanging on the living room wall, my heart broke a little more. Mark had ordered me to take it down, saying it ruined the festive atmosphere, but I refused with a defiant look. It was my only act of resistance. Finally, with a long grunt, he allowed me to leave it in its place. Time passed quickly and cruelly. The smell of food began to fill the house. I was cooking a pot roast, garlic shrimp, and a large loaded baked potato casserole. Dishes that would be served at a party or on a day of celebration, not at a banquet built on grief. Cold sweat ran down my temples. My clothes were soaked with sweat and water from washing dishes. I carefully placed the ceramic plates on the long dining room table. Those plates had been a wedding gift from my mother. I remembered her wrinkled hands caressing them as she gave them to me. Now they would be used by people who didn't care about her death. Mark came out of the room elegantly dressed and smelling of strong cologne. He looked confident and arrogant. He inspected my work like a ruthless foreman. He tasted a bit of the gravy from the pot roast and nodded, without a single word of thanks. Instead, he pointed out my disheveled appearance. He scolded me again, telling me to take a shower and change my clothes quickly. He didn't want his friends to see his wife looking like a miserable servant. He emphasized that I should smile, be friendly, and attend to any request from the guests. He said he didn't want to see a single complaint or a single tear when they arrived. I dragged myself to the bathroom. Under the shower stream, I cried bitterly. The sound of the water drowned my sobs of anguish. I scrubbed my body hard, as if trying to wash away the traces of grief that had clung to me. But the grief was not on my skin. It was in my blood and in my breath. After the shower, I put on a simple, sober dress. I wore no makeup, as no cosmetics could hide my swollen eyes. I looked at myself in the mirror. A pale face, lifeless eyes surrounded by dark circles. It was the face of a daughter who had lost her mother. A face forced to wear a mask of happiness for her husband's pride. When I left the room, Mark was already by the front door. He commented sarcastically that my face still looked pathetic, but that there was no time to fix it further. Just then, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat, not with joy, but with anxiety. The first guest had arrived. The hellish party was about to begin. Mark's expression changed instantly. A fake, radiant smile spread across his lips. He opened the door enthusiastically, greeting the guest with a loud laugh. I stood behind him with my head bowed, taking a deep breath of the air that felt oppressive, and prepared to play the role of a servant in my own home on the day of my mother's death. As soon as the door swung wide open, the tranquility of our home vanished. Mark's co-workers burst in loudly, bringing with them a mix of different perfumes and deafening laughter. They entered without asking. Their shoes echoed on the floor I had cleaned with so much effort. No one offered me their condolences. Perhaps Mark hadn't told them. Or perhaps, for them, the death of an old woman wasn't important enough to ruin a party atmosphere. They immediately scattered throughout the living and dining rooms, admiring the furniture and praising Mark's success on his recent promotion. I stood in a corner holding a tray with glasses of cold iced tea that I had prepared beforehand. Mark introduced me quickly, not as his grieving wife, but as the hostess ready to serve. Some of them nodded politely, but their gazes were empty. They looked at me briefly before returning to their lively conversations with Mark. Mark seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the moment. He was the center of attention, telling unfunny jokes that were met with exaggerated laughter from his subordinates. Each burst of laughter was like a needle piercing my heart. Their laughter sounded like a grotesque dissonance with my desolate mood. It was like a masquerade ball in the middle of a cemetery. My first duty began. Mark gestured with his eyes for me to serve the drinks quickly. I walked slowly, offering the tray to each guest. My hands trembled from the weight of the tray and from the emotion I was trying to suppress. One of Mark's friends, a burly man, took a glass without even looking at me, too busy talking about a new project they were about to launch. The glasses passed quickly from hand to hand. I had to go back and forth to the kitchen to refill the pitcher and bring out appetizers. My legs, already tired from standing for hours at the funeral home, ached even more, but I dared not sit down. Mark was always watching me from the corner of his eye, making sure I didn't rest for a second. The atmosphere grew even louder when the second group arrived. Among them was a woman who stood out particularly. Her name was Jessica. She was a colleague Mark often mentioned at home for her achievements, but I could sense something more in the way Mark looked at her. Jessica entered with a very confident air, as if she owned the place. She greeted Mark with familiarity, even touching his arm in a way that was too close while smiling cheerfully. Mark seemed delighted by Jessica's arrival. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen when he looked at me. Jessica examined me from head to toe with a look of dismissive evaluation. There was no kind smile on her lips when she looked at me, only a faint, cunning smirk. Mark immediately led Jessica and some of his closest friends to the most comfortable spot, the main sofa. He called out my name loudly and ordered me to bring a plate of food for Jessica. He said Jessica was a special guest and should be well taken care of. I swallowed, holding back the bitterness rising in my chest. I brought a plate and filled it with the food I had prepared earlier through tears. The pot roast, the garlic shrimp, and a piece of the loaded baked potato casserole were carefully arranged on the plate. I brought it to Jessica and offered it to her respectfully. Jessica accepted it without a single word of thanks. She looked at it with a mocking glance and began to eat while continuing to talk with Mark, ignoring my presence as I stood waiting for her next instructions. The incident happened in an instant. Just as I was about to turn around to go to the kitchen for some napkins, I suddenly heard the loud sound of a plate falling. Crash! The sound of ceramic shattering against the floor silenced the room for a moment. All eyes turned to the main sofa. I turned and saw the plate I had given Jessica smashed to pieces on the floor. The greasy gravy from the pot roast and the food stained my mother's favorite rug. Jessica jumped up with an expression of exaggerated surprise and looked at me accusatorially. She shouted in a high-pitched tone that I hadn't placed the plate correctly and that it had slipped from her hands, but I was sure I had handed it to her properly. Mark reacted instantly. Instead of asking what had happened or worrying that someone might get cut by the ceramic shards, he scolded me in front of everyone. He berated me with harsh words, calling me careless and incapable of serving the guests properly. My face flushed, a mixture of shame and pain. The tears I had been barely holding back welled up again. I wanted to defend myself and say that Jessica had dropped it, but my courage vanished under Mark's withering glare. I knew that if I contradicted him, he would get even angrier and humiliate me further. On the other hand, Jessica adopted a victim's expression. She shook her foot, splattered with a bit of gravy, and complained that her shoes were stained. Gathering what was left of my dignity, I knelt on the floor. I began to pick up the sharp pieces of ceramic with my bare hands. Some guests looked at me with pity, but no one dared to help me, fearing they would provoke Mark's wrath. Jessica continued to complain about her shoes and ordered me to clean the stain on the rug quickly so it wouldn't smell. I brought a cloth and knelt at Jessica's feet, scrubbing the pot roast stain while trying to contain my sobs so they wouldn't be heard. I felt my dignity being mercilessly trampled upon. In my mother's house, on the day of her death, I was being treated worse than a servant by my husband and his friend. After cleaning the floor, Mark ordered me to go to the kitchen and not come out until his anger had passed. With the pieces of the broken plate, which had been silent witnesses to my humiliation, I walked hesitantly to the kitchen. In the kitchen, I leaned against the sink and turned the faucet on full blast to drown out the sound of my sobs, which finally broke free. I cried bitterly, calling out to my mother in my heart, "Mom, look at your daughter. It's me, Sarah. Why did you leave so soon? I can't take this, Mom." The physical and mental exhaustion made me feel dizzy, but before I could calm down, Mark appeared at the kitchen door. He hadn't come to apologize. He had come to order me to peel fruit because the guests wanted dessert. With hands trembling from crying, I wiped my tears harshly. I peeled the fruit. Mark returned to the living room, and shortly after, the laughter resumed. The music was turned up. They seemed to have forgotten the earlier incident or simply didn't care. They ate, drank, and joked over my pain. The clock struck 4 p.m. The sky outside was beginning to darken. With the faint hope of getting a shred of compassion from my husband, I brought the fruit tray to the living room and placed it on the table with my head bowed, trying to avoid Jessica's triumphant gaze. Suddenly, amidst the clamor of that suffocating party, the soft purr of a car engine was heard stopping right in front of the house's fence. It wasn't the sound of just any car, but the hum of a luxury vehicle's engine. Several guests sitting near the window looked outside and instantly fell silent. They whispered with tense faces. Mark, who was holding a glass of iced tea and laughing loudly, also stopped abruptly when he saw who was getting out of that car, a sleek black sedan, the kind of car only owned by top executives of major corporations. A uniformed chauffeur got out and politely opened the back door. The festive atmosphere that had been chaotic just a moment ago was suddenly silenced, as if someone had hit the mute button. One of Mark's friends, bewildered, turned off the music. Everyone stood up with a clumsy and respectful attitude. Through the open front door walked a middle-aged man, dressed in an impeccable suit and with a very intense aura of leadership. It was Mr. Harrison, the owner of the company where Mark worked, the highly respected president. Mark turned pale. He absolutely did not expect his top boss to come to his humble home. Besides, he hadn't invited him because he didn't consider himself at that level. Mr. Harrison entered with an impassive expression. His eyes scanned the entire messy room, filled with the remnants of the party. Then his gaze stopped precisely on my eyes, swollen and red. The silence that fell over the living room contrasted dramatically with the noise of the party just a few seconds before, and it became suffocating. President Harrison stopped at the threshold, emanating an aura of authority that would intimidate anyone. He wore a very expensive-looking dark gray suit that contrasted with the casual shirts of Mark's friends. His hair, beginning to gray, was neatly combed back, and his penetrating gaze swept the room as if conducting a surprise inspection of a troubled branch office. There was no smile on his face, only a firm jaw and an unreadable expression. Mark's body, which just a moment ago had stood tall with an arrogant chin, now seemed to shrink. His face, previously flushed with anger towards me or laughter with his friends, had turned pale as paper. Cold sweat began to bead on his forehead, and his hand, holding a glass, trembled so violently that he spilled some of its contents. Mark hurriedly placed the glass on a nearby table with a movement so clumsy he almost knocked it over. He nervously adjusted the collar of his shirt, trying to gather the fragments of his shattered confidence. With hasty and somewhat faltering steps, Mark approached Mr. Harrison. He gave a slight nod, an exaggerated and fawning gesture of respect. His voice cracked as he addressed his supreme boss. Mark expressed how surprised and honored he was that Mr. Harrison would visit his humble abode. He apologized for not sending a formal invitation, explaining that it was a small celebration with his department team and that he hadn't dared to bother Mr. Harrison with his valuable time. Mark continued to talk, tripping over his words. Honeyed words poured out of his mouth incessantly, as if trying to hide the panic that had seized him. He invited Mr. Harrison to come in, offering him the most comfortable seat on the sofa, the same one Jessica had occupied earlier. But Mr. Harrison did not immediately respond to Mark's warm welcome. He only nodded very slowly, without taking his scrutinizing gaze off him. Mr. Harrison entered slowly. His gleaming shoes made a rhythmic sound on the tiled floor. The other guests, Mark's colleagues, automatically moved aside to let him pass. They stood rigid as statues, afraid of making the slightest mistake in front of the owner of the company who held their destinies in his hands. Jessica, who had been sitting like a queen on the main sofa, quickly stood up, fixed her hair and clothes, and put on her sweetest smile, hoping to attract the president's attention. Jessica even tugged slightly at Mark's arm, signaling him to introduce her to Mr. Harrison, but Mr. Harrison seemed not to see them. His gaze focused instead on the tacky party decorations, the dirty dishes scattered about, and the food scraps that had not yet been cleaned up. Mark felt even more bewildered by Mr. Harrison's cold reaction. He tried to break the ice by offering him drinks and food. He shouted my name, but this time not with the harsh voice from before, but in a softly feigned tone, yet laden with pressure. He asked me to quickly bring a hot drink for Mr. Harrison. Perhaps the best tea or coffee we had. I, who had been standing like a statue in a corner near the kitchen door, was startled. My heart was pounding. I felt very ashamed. My appearance was not at all appropriate to receive a guest like Mr. Harrison. My clothes were damp from washing dishes, my eyes were very swollen, and my face was pale and without makeup. I wanted to hide, to run to a back room and not come out until everyone had left. But in this house, Mark's orders were law, especially in front of his boss. With heavy steps, I went to the kitchen to prepare the tea. My hands trembled as I took out the best porcelain cup we had left in the cabinet. My mind was in chaos. Why was Mr. Harrison here? Mark said he hadn't invited him. Was it a coincidence, or was there some urgent matter? As I poured the hot water, I could hear Mark's voice in the living room, still trying to explain the party. Mark lied. He said the party had been organized at the request of his friends, who wanted to celebrate his success, and that he had felt bad refusing. He tried to create an image of a loyal team leader, beloved by his subordinates. I smiled bitterly upon hearing his lies. My tears fell again into the teacup. I wiped them away hastily. I must not cry in front of the distinguished guest. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the turmoil in my chest, and returned to the living room with a tray containing the cup of hot tea. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere was still silent and tense. Mr. Harrison had not sat down. He was still standing in the middle of the room, rejecting Mark's offer to sit on the sofa. Mark looked even more uneasy. Sweat was already soaking the collar of his shirt. Jessica stood next to Mark, trying to maintain a friendly smile, but her smile seemed forced as she was ignored. As I approached with the tray in my hands, Mr. Harrison suddenly turned towards me. His movement was abrupt and focused. His gaze, which was cold when he looked at Mark, transformed into something difficult to interpret when it fell on my face. There was surprise, scrutiny, and also a flash of deep compassion. My steps stopped instantly, paralyzed by the intensity of that middle-aged man's gaze. The distance between us was only a few feet. Realizing that Mr. Harrison was looking at me, Mark hastily stepped in between us. He blocked Mr. Harrison's line of sight as if ashamed to acknowledge my presence. With a dismissive tone, he said that I was just his wife helping with the guests and apologized if my appearance offended Mr. Harrison's sight. Mark even added the foolish excuse that I wasn't feeling well, which was why my face was pale and lifeless. He tried to divert Mr. Harrison's attention back to him, talking about the sales targets for the next month that he had already surpassed, but Mark's efforts were in vain. Mr. Harrison did not listen at all to Mark's ramblings about sales figures or marketing strategies. Mr. Harrison raised his hand slightly, a firm signal for Mark to be quiet. Mark's mouth closed instantly. His sentence was cut off mid-thought. The room fell silent again. It even seemed like people were holding their breath. Mr. Harrison moved past a petrified Mark and walked directly towards me. I felt my heart stop. I dared not look him in the eye and lowered my head, afraid of making some mistake that could anger Mark even more or even get him fired. My hands, holding the tray, trembled more forcefully, causing the teacup on it to clink slightly. Mr. Harrison stopped right in front of me. An elegant and expensive cologne emanated from his body, masking the smell of food that permeated my clothes. Unexpectedly, Mr. Harrison extended his hand, not for the teacup, but to steady the tray that was about to fall from my trembling hands. His touch was firm and warm, conveying a strange sense of security. He took the tray from me and placed it himself on a nearby table, an action that stunned everyone in the room. The president of a major corporation serving the host. Mark almost choked seeing the scene. Jessica watched with her mouth slightly open. Mr. Harrison looked at me again, not caring about the confused glances of the guests. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and resonant as he asked a single-sentence question that pierced straight through the heart of my emotional defenses. "Why are you crying, ma'am?" he asked gently, but with authority. That question, filled with a genuine, fatherly concern, broke down the wall that had been cracking since morning. President Harrison's question hung in the air, heavy and demanding. "Why are you crying?" The sentence echoed in my ears, stirring the emotions I had desperately suppressed to save my husband's face. I bit my lower lip hard to hold back a sob that threatened to erupt. My eyes burned, tears welled up, blurring my vision. How should I answer? If I told the truth, Mark would be furious. If I lied, my heart would break even more. I glanced sideways at Mark. My husband was glaring at me, a clear threat that said, "Don't say anything stupid." His face was tense, his jaw clenched. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, a signal for me to stay quiet or find another excuse. Seeing that I remained silent with my head down, Mark, impatient, intervened. He let out a chuckle, a clumsy and forced sound. He approached Mr. Harrison, trying to pat his boss on the shoulder, but restrained himself at the last moment. With a condescending tone, Mark said, "Please excuse my wife, sir. She's like that, a bit of a crybaby and overly sensitive. You know how women are. Maybe she's emotional about your visit, or just tired from cooking all day." "It's nothing, Mr. Harrison. Don't worry." Mark tried to minimize my feelings, to turn my pain into a joke or a common female weakness. He wanted to hide at all costs that he was celebrating a party on top of his wife's grief. But Mr. Harrison was not so easily fooled. He didn't laugh. On the contrary, his face grew even more serious. He turned slowly to face Mark. His gaze was as sharp as a hawk stalking its prey. "Mr. Evans," Mr. Harrison said in a low voice that nonetheless rumbled in the silence of the room, "I didn't ask you. I am asking your wife." The sentence was short, concise, and lethal. Mark fell silent instantly, his face flushed with shame at being reprimanded in front of his subordinates. Jessica, who was near Mark, also lowered her head, not daring to look up, pretending to adjust her watch. The situation had been reversed. Now it was Mark who seemed small and helpless. Mr. Harrison turned back to me. His expression softened, creating a safe space for me to speak. "Answer me, ma'am. Don't be afraid. Tell me the truth." Mr. Harrison's words seemed to give me a new strength, a strength I didn't know where it came from, perhaps from the spirit of my mother, who would not tolerate her daughter being treated unfairly. I slowly raised my head. I saw Mark's face filled with fear and anger, but this time the fear I felt for him was not greater than the pain in my heart. I remembered the peaceful face of my mother in her grave that very afternoon. I remembered how much she wanted my happiness, and now, in the house she had left me, I was being treated like a slave. It was enough. I could no longer hide this rot. With a trembling but increasingly firm voice, I began to speak. "Excuse me, sir, if my appearance has made you uncomfortable," I began, my voice hoarse. "I'm not crying because I'm a crybaby or out of emotion. I'm crying because my heart is broken, sir." I paused to catch my breath. My chest was tight. Everyone was looking at me. The guests who were eating merrily before had now put down their plates. The atmosphere was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the clock. 2 hours ago, just 2 hours, I returned from my mother's funeral. My own mother passed away yesterday afternoon, and she was buried just this afternoon. That confession was like a time bomb that exploded. Instantly, gasps of surprise were heard from several guests. They looked at each other with horrified faces. Some covered their mouths as they realized the cruelty of the situation they were celebrating. They had been eating and laughing in a house of mourning on the day of the funeral. Guilt began to appear on the faces of Mark's colleagues. They felt deceived. As Mark had not informed them of my mother's death, Jessica seemed the most uneasy. She slowly backed away, trying to get out of the spotlight. Her face was pale. Realizing the social impact of the event, I continued my story without paying attention to their reactions. While I still had the courage, my husband, Mark, forced me to go ahead with this party. He said my mother's death was not important, that life must go on, and that his promotion was more valuable than my period of mourning. He ordered me to dry my tears, cook all this food, and serve his friends with a smile, as if nothing had happened. The dirt on my mother's grave is still fresh, sir. The chrysanthemums on her grave haven't even begun to wilt. But here, in this house, the music is blasting, and I am forbidden to be sad. My tears started to flow again, but this time I let them run while holding my head high. I had verbalized the truth that had been suppressed by my husband's pride. Mark looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He opened his mouth to deny it, but no sound came out. He realized he was finished. All eyes were now on him, filled with disgust and disbelief. The same colleagues who had praised him earlier now looked at him like a monster. How could a man be so cruel to his wife? How could he celebrate a party right after burying his mother-in-law? The reputation Mark had built over the years crumbled in an instant. Mr. Harrison listened to my entire story without blinking. His face slowly changed. From an impassive and authoritative expression, it now emanated extreme anger. His jaw tensed so much that the veins in his neck stood out. His right hand clenched into a tight fist at his side. His face turned red with contained fury. He looked at Mark with a murderous glare. The calm leadership aura from before had vanished, replaced by the terrifying aura of a man witnessing an injustice before his very eyes. Mr. Harrison approached Mark. Now the distance between them was minimal. Mark backed away step by step until his back hit the wall. He was cornered, with no escape. Mr. Harrison pointed at Mark's face, just inches from his nose. His voice was no longer low but boomed through the room, making the window panes tremble. "Mr. Evans, is what your wife says true? You held a promotion party on your mother-in-law's grave on the same day your wife lost her mother?" The shout was so loud that Jessica flinched and dropped her purse. Mark was trembling violently, his knees weak. He tried to stammer an incoherent excuse. "No, sir, this was planned a long time ago. It wasn't my intention." Those stupid excuses sounded even more pathetic to everyone's ears. Mark tried to grab Mr. Harrison's hand to plead for understanding, but Mr. Harrison snatched it away abruptly, as if Mark's hand were something disgusting. "Shut up, Mr." Harrison yelled again. "I don't need your excuses. I thought you were an upstanding and decent employee, but you're nothing but a human being without a conscience. You have tormented your grieving wife to satisfy your pride and vanity. You forced her to prepare a party before her tears had even dried." Mr. Harrison looked around the room at the guests, who now bowed their heads in shame. "And all of you have eaten and drunk heartily in a house of mourning. Where is your conscience?" The guests remained silent. Shame and guilt struck them. The party had turned into a moral tribunal in an instant. The music had long been turned off. The laughter had vanished, replaced by a suffocating tension. I remained in my place, crying tears of relief, feeling that I had finally lifted that weight off my chest. But I didn't know yet that the real shock was about to begin. Mr. Harrison turned to look at Mark, who looked like a drowned rat. Mr. Harrison's gaze suggested that for him, this was not just a moral issue. There was a personal anger in it. He took a deep breath, controlling his emotions before dropping the next atomic bomb that would destroy Mark's life forever. "Mr. Evans," Mr. Harrison said in an icy tone, "you may be proud of your new position. You may feel big in front of your friends, but you've forgotten one very important thing. Mr. Harrison stepped closer again and whispered with a clarity that reached Mark's ringing ears. "You underestimated your mother-in-law. You thought she was just some ordinary person. She is not." Mr. Harrison smiled with disdain, a terrible smile. "There's something you should know, Mark. Everyone who's anyone in this town knows perfectly well who your mother-in-law was, the one who just passed away." He paused dramatically, letting fear course through every nerve in Mark's body. "Everyone knows and respects her, except you, her stupid son-in-law." Mark lifted his head. His eyes were wide with confusion and fear. He didn't understand Mr. Harrison's words. "My mother-in-law was just a retired teacher," he thought. "What does she have to do with the business world?" But seeing Mr. Harrison's expression. Mark realized he had made a much bigger mistake than throwing an ill-timed party, a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. President Harrison's last words hung in the air like a recent thunderclap, leaving a terrifying echo in the ears of everyone present. Mark, his mouth slightly agape and blinking rapidly, seemed to be trying to process the information that had just entered his brain, but his arrogant logic refused to accept it. His face, previously pale, now showed an expression of pathetic confusion. He tried to force a small laugh, a dry sound that was extremely inappropriate amidst the suffocating tension. Gathering the last vestiges of his arrogance, Mark attempted to deny the reality presented to him. He slowly shook his head and looked at Mr. Harrison with a foolish, condescending gaze, as if the president had just told a bad joke. Mark took a small step forward, an incredibly presumptuous act, as if trying to place himself on the same level as Mr. Harrison. With a voice that tried to sound as indifferent as possible, Mark said that Mr. Harrison must be mistaken or misinformed. Mark explained confidently that his mother-in-law, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, was just an ordinary old woman who lived off her late father's modest pension. Mark even added with a mocking tone that Mrs. Vance used to grow vegetables in the backyard, wore old clothes, and often asked him for more money for her expenses. In Mark's eyes, Mrs. Vance was a burden, an old parasite with no value other than to annoy him. He was convinced that Mr. Harrison was coincidentally talking about someone else with the same name. Hearing Mark's ramblings, which further denigrated the deceased, Mr. Harrison did not erupt in anger as before. This time his reaction was much more frightening. He laughed, a short, cynical, and cold laugh that chilled the blood of everyone in the room. Mr. Harrison looked at Mark as one looks at a small, disgusting insect that doesn't know it's about to be crushed. He began to walk slowly around Mark, as if observing a defective exhibit. The sound of Mr. Harrison's footsteps on the tile floor echoed loudly in the silent room. The guests, including Jessica, held their breath, sensing that a monumental revelation was about to occur. Jessica, standing in a corner, began to feel uncomfortable. Her instincts told her she had bet on the wrong horse. Mr. Harrison stopped right in front of Mark, looking deep into his eyes. With a calm voice, but laden with force in every syllable, Mr. Harrison began to speak. He said that Mark's ignorance demonstrated how blind his mind and eyes had been all this time. Mr. Harrison explained that Mrs. Vance had chosen a simple life, away from luxury, and had shunned public attention. But he revealed that behind those modest clothes and those soil-stained hands from the garden, Mrs. Vance was the brilliant mind behind the founding of the gigantic corporation for which Mark worked. She was the founder and the majority shareholder with absolute authority over the company's direction. For years, Mrs. Vance had controlled the business from the shadows, allowing executives like Mr. Harrison to be the public face while she enjoyed a quiet life with her daughter. Mark stumbled backward as if he had been slapped by an invisible hand. His legs instantly gave way. His memory flashed back in time. He remembered how many times he had scolded Mrs. Vance for trivial matters, like the food being bland or the floor not being clean enough. He remembered the time he yelled at her when Mrs. Vance asked for money for her medicine, when in reality, if she had wanted to, she could have bought the entire hospital. He remembered how he had always boasted in front of Mrs. Vance about being the pillar of the family, bragging about his salary, which was nothing more than crumbs compared to his mother-in-law's fortune. Extreme shame, mixed with a paralyzing fear, began to take hold of him. He had been insulting the boss of his boss, the owner of the throne to which he begged for his livelihood. Mr. Harrison was not finished. He pointed at Mark's face again, this time with his index finger, trembling with contained emotion. He shouted loudly for everyone in the room to hear this painful truth. Mr. Harrison said, "Mark, everyone who's anyone in this town, all my colleagues, all the major investors know who Mrs. Vance is. They bow to her in respect. They honor her wisdom and her power. Everyone knows how great she is, except you." The words, "except you," were spoken in a sharp tone that struck Mark's chest. Mr. Harrison continued, saying that Mark was the only person who had been physically closest to Mrs. Vance. He lived under the same roof. He ate at the same table. But in mind and knowledge, he was the farthest person. Mark's stupidity and arrogance had blinded him, preventing him from seeing the diamond he had in his own home. Mark collapsed to the floor. His legs could no longer support his trembling body. His face was ashen, like a corpse's. He stared at the empty floor with a lost look. His pride was shattered. His future was shattered. His company colleagues looked at him with a mixture of astonishment, disgust, and pity. They whispered, realizing they had been worshipping the wrong man. They had just been in the house of the company's owner, eating food prepared by the owner's daughter, and had mocked the death of the company's owner herself. Guilt overwhelmed them. One by one, they began to slowly back towards the exit, wishing to escape this embarrassing situation quickly. Jessica, realizing that Mark was no longer a valuable asset but a dangerous liability, remained silent. She picked up her bag and tried to slip away among the guests, but the drama was not yet over. Mr. Harrison noticed the guests' intention to leave, raised his hand, and ordered everyone to stay put. He said no one could leave the room until the matter was settled. Mr. Harrison wanted everyone to witness what was about to happen. He wanted this moment to serve as a moral lesson about integrity and karma for all his employees. The atmosphere in the room became suffocating again. No one dared to contradict the president's order. They all remained like statues, heads bowed, awaiting punishment or at least a long lecture. But Mr. Harrison had no intention of lecturing. He turned to me. His gaze softened instantly. He called his personal secretary, who was waiting outside, to bring a black leather briefcase. I was still in my place, paralyzed in silence. My tears had already dried, replaced by a monumental shock. I knew my mother had savings, but I never imagined she was a tycoon. She had never told me. She had always taught me to be austere, to live with gratitude. It turned out that was all her way of educating me so I wouldn't be blinded by wealth. And now I understood why my mother always smiled patiently whenever Mark belittled her. She wasn't weak, she was simply observing Mark's theater with compassion. She was testing her son-in-law, and Mark had failed spectacularly. My heart ached thinking of my mother's loneliness, keeping this secret to protect my marriage. Mr. Harrison's secretary, a young man with glasses and an impeccable suit, entered the room with a steady pace. In his hands, he carried a very important-looking black leather briefcase. He gave a respectful nod to Mr. Harrison and then to me. It was the first time a stranger had shown me such deference in this house. Normally, Mark's guests treated me like an invisible being or a free servant. The secretary placed the briefcase on the coffee table, which was dirty with the remnants of the party. The sound of the briefcase's latch opening, a click, resonated sharply in the suffocating silence. Mark, who was collapsed on the floor, slightly raised his head. His eyes were fixed on the briefcase with a mixture of fear and greedy curiosity. Perhaps in some corner of his rotten heart, he still hoped for a small share. Mr. Harrison took out a large brown envelope sealed with red wax bearing the official logo of a notary. He held the envelope carefully, as if it were a precious relic. He explained to everyone present that his visit today was not actually to attend Mark's stupid party, but to execute the last will of the late Mrs. Vance. Mr. Harrison recounted that a week before she passed away, Mrs. Vance had secretly called the notary and him to the hospital to draft this will. Mrs. Vance sensed her time was running out and wanted to ensure her only daughter's future was secure, and she also wanted to pass her final judgment on her son-in-law. Mr. Harrison slowly broke the seal on the envelope. The sound of tearing paper was painful. He pulled out several sheets of thick paper. Mark held his breath. You could see the tension in his neck. Jessica, trapped near the door, also pricked up her ears. Her materialistic nature made her curious about the amount of assets that would be mentioned. Mr. Harrison began to read the contents of the will in a loud, clear voice. The first point specified the list of Mrs. Vance's assets, a list so long it would leave anyone who heard it speechless. From the majority stake in the parent company where Mark worked to several commercial buildings downtown, vast tracts of land on the outskirts, and huge cash deposits in various banks. It was even revealed that this very house we lived in, the ownership of the land and the building, was entirely in Mrs. Vance's name. despite Mark always claiming to have remodeled it with his own effort. Upon hearing the list of assets, the expression on Mark's face changed every second. Moving from astonishment to admiration and extreme regret, he clutched his head in frustration. He now realized he had been sleeping on a mountain of gold while treating the owner of that gold like trash. If only he had been a little kinder to Mrs. Vance. If he had truly cared for her, perhaps now he would be enjoying all those luxuries. Greed was evident in Mark's eyes. He began to imagine the luxurious life that had slipped through his fingers. He looked at me with pleading eyes, hoping I could soften Mr. Harrison's heart or change the contents of the will in his favor. But Mr. Harrison had not yet reached the most important part. He cleared his throat to refocus everyone's attention. He read the crucial clause, the heart of the will, a special clause that Mrs. Vance had drafted herself with utmost care. Mr. Harrison read the sentence, "All my assets, stocks, real estate, and cash will be inherited in their entirety by my only daughter, Sarah. To my son-in-law, Mark, not a single cent will be allocated. Unless, Mr. Harrison paused, making Mark's heart pound with hope. There's an unless, there's still hope, Mark thought. Mr. Harrison continued, in an even colder tone. Unless it is proven that Mark has been a faithful husband, who has respected and loved my daughter and me until the end of my days. But if it is proven that Mark has hurt my daughter's heart, neglected me in my old age, or engaged in inappropriate behavior, this right of inheritance will be closed to him forever, and any financial access I might have provided him through the company will be immediately withdrawn. Mr. Harrison closed the document forcefully. A dry sound echoed. He looked at Mark with a murderous glare. And today, Mr. Evans, before my own eyes and dozens of witnesses, you have proven that you do not meet that exception clause. You have done the exact opposite. You celebrated a party on your wife's grief. You have insulted me and the deceased. Therefore, I hereby declare that Mrs. Vance's will comes into full effect. You receive nothing, not a single cent. Mark screamed. His scream was not of pain, but of rage and desperation, the scream of a loser who had lost everything. He tried to get up and lunge at the table to snatch the documents, shouting that it was unfair, that as a husband he was entitled to his wife's assets. But before he could touch the table, two burly bodyguards of Mr. Harrison instantly restrained him, twisting his arms behind his back, and Mark groaned in pain. Mark thrashed like a madman, cursing Mr. Harrison, Mrs. Vance, and even me. His mask had completely fallen. His violent and greedy nature was exposed to everyone. I looked at Mark with an empty gaze. The love I once had for him, a love I gave sincerely despite being hurt often, had now disappeared without a trace. Seeing him go crazy over an inheritance when my mother's grave was still fresh, I realized he had never loved me. He only loved himself and the comfort I provided. Mother, you were right. This test has opened my eyes. I walked to the table and stood beside Mr. Harrison. I placed my hand on the will. The paper felt cold, but in it I could feel the warm love of my mother. She had protected me even after her death. She had made sure I would not be used by the wrong man. Mr. Harrison turned to me and nodded respectfully. Mrs. Evans, he said. That form of address made Mark react even more hysterically, because now my status was far superior to his. According to your mother's will, from this moment on, you are the legal owner of these assets, and as the majority shareholder, you have voting power in the company's decisions, including the fate of immoral employees. Mr. Harrison stared at Mark and Jessica. That sentence was the signal for the counterattack. Now the power was in my hands. I looked at Jessica, who was now as pale as paper. She realized her career was on the brink of collapse. She tried to smile at me, a smile that was a mixture of fear and flattery, but I turned away. The atmosphere in the room had changed 180 degrees. The guests who had previously looked down on me now bowed their heads in fear. They realized their jobs could depend on my mood, but I wasn't interested in them. My focus was solely on the two traitors before me, Mark and Jessica. I took a deep breath, inhaling the air of freedom mixed with the scent of grief. It was time to clean the trash out of my life, just as I had cleaned the trash from their party earlier. Mr. Harrison signaled his secretary again. The secretary took out a tablet and turned it on. In addition to the will, Mr. Harrison said, looking alternately at Jessica and Mark, "Our internal audit team has found some suspicious transactions made by Mr. Evans during his tenure. And interestingly, that spending pattern coincides with the lavish lifestyle of one employee." Mr. Harrison stared at Jessica. "Miss Davis, perhaps you can explain how you acquired designer handbags and expensive jewelry on a normal employee's salary, because our data shows that the company funds embezzled by Mr. Evans flowed into the items you are wearing right now." Mark's eyes widened. He had forgotten about the petty embezzlement he had committed to please Jessica, thinking no one would check the details of operating expenses. But now, under the president's direct audit, all his wrongdoings came to light. Jessica's face transformed into a mask of pure terror. She was trembling violently. The expensive handbag she was holding fell to the floor. The secret of her affair and her corruption was exposed all at once. It was no longer about a lost inheritance, but a possible prison sentence. The atmosphere in the living room, which had been deathly silent, transformed into a heated courtroom. President Harrison's secretary held up the tablet, slowly turning it so everyone could see the incriminating evidence on the screen. Mark's eyes widened as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. The screen clearly displayed a series of figures and transactions he had kept hidden behind piles of false financial reports. Mark thought he was smart. He thought he could cheat the company's audit system by dividing large expenses into small receipts under headings like operations expenses or client entertainment. But he had forgotten that the company he worked for had been founded by his late mother-in-law, and its surveillance systems were far more sophisticated than his twisted mind. President Harrison pointed to the tablet screen with an accusing finger. He began to break down Mark's sins, one by one, in front of his wife and his mistress. The president's voice was monotonous but sharp, tearing apart the last vestiges of Mark's pride. He read a transaction from a month ago for the purchase of a designer handbag at a luxury boutique. The date coincided with the day Mark told me he had to work all night due to a surprise audit. It turned out his audit consisted of going on a luxury shopping spree with Jessica using the company credit card. I felt a tightness in my chest, not from jealousy, but from deep disgust. While I was saving money at home to pay the electricity bill, my husband was squandering company money on another woman. Jessica, whose name was mentioned in the audit report, was trembling violently. Her pretty, made-up face was now stained with cold sweat. She shook her head, panicking, and tried to extricate herself in the most cowardly way possible. Jessica screamed in a high-pitched voice, claiming she had no idea where the money came from. She excused herself by saying Mark had given it to her as a gift and that she thought it was his personal money. Jessica began to cry, but they were not tears of remorse, but crocodile tears to save herself. She pointed at Mark with a finger adorned with fake nails, accusing him of deceiving her. She said he had seduced her and pressured her into accepting those gifts. Hearing Jessica's betrayal, Mark became furious. His face turned as red as a tomato, and the veins in his neck bulged. He couldn't accept being the only one to blame. The illicit relationship they had flaunted, the one they called true love behind my back, crumbled in an instant when their personal interests were threatened. Mark struck back at Jessica. He shouted that she was the one who was always asking for things. Mark revealed that Jessica had threatened to break up with him if he didn't buy her a new piece of jewelry. They insulted each other publicly, airing each other's dirty laundry, blaming each other. The scene was both pathetic and cathartic. The two people who had united to hurt me were now tearing each other apart like stray dogs fighting over a bone. The guests, Mark's colleagues, watched the fight with their mouths agape. They felt disgusted watching this cheap drama. They now realized how rotten the morals of their boss and their colleague were. Whispers and mocking laughter began to be heard. Jessica's reputation as an elegant career woman collapsed in an instant, being labeled a materialistic gold digger. Mark's reputation as a faithful husband and wise leader also vanished, becoming a stupid, unfaithful, corrupt man. Amidst the chaos, President Harrison signaled his secretary to play a video. It was a recording from the security camera of a luxury restaurant. The screen clearly showed Mark and Jessica on a romantic dinner date, holding hands and laughing happily. The date of the video was our 3rd wedding anniversary. That day, Mark had told me he had a stomach ache and had gone to bed early in our room. It turned out that after I fell asleep, exhausted from household chores, he had snuck out to meet Jessica. Seeing that visual proof, my heart felt as if a giant hand was squeezing it. It hurt, it was bitter. But strangely, I also felt relief. Relief, because all my suspicions were confirmed. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't paranoid. My wife's instinct was right. They were traitors. I approached the couple who were still arguing. My steps were quiet, but each one silenced them. Perhaps the aura of authority I had inherited from Mrs. Vance now ran through my veins. I looked directly into Jessica's eyes. The woman instantly lowered her head, not daring to meet my gaze. She had looked down on me before for my simple appearance, but now she seemed very small before me. I spoke in a low but powerful voice. I told Jessica that I had known everything for a long time, but I had kept silent, hoping Mark would change. But it turned out my silence had only emboldened them. I pointed to the plates of food scattered on the table, the same food Jessica had tasted and despised earlier. I told her in an icy tone to enjoy that last meal. I told her it was the last meal she would eat comfortably in this house, and perhaps the last decent meal before facing justice. My words terrified Jessica even more. She tried to grab my hand, begging for forgiveness, calling me Dear Sarah in an attempt at familiarity, but I pulled my hand away in disgust. I didn't need apologies from the woman who had destroyed my home and insulted my mother on the day of her funeral. President Harrison looked at me with pride. He saw in me the reflection of Mrs. Vance. He took control of the situation again. In a firm voice, President Harrison declared that this evidence was more than enough to bring them to justice. Embezzlement of company funds was not a minor issue, it was a criminal offense. President Harrison ordered his bodyguards to confiscate the handbag and jewelry Jessica was wearing as evidence. Those items had been purchased with company money and were technically company property. Jessica screamed hysterically. When the bodyguard asked her to remove her watch and designer bag, she was completely humiliated and stripped of her luxuries in front of all the people who had once admired her. Her mask was completely broken, revealing her true, greedy, and cowardly nature. Mark watched as Jessica was treated like a criminal and knew he was next. Reality hit him with brutal force. The director position he had just celebrated was gone. The inheritance he dreamed of had vanished. The mistress he boasted about turned out to be a latent enemy, and the wife he had trampled on now had full control of his destiny. Mark's legs gave out. He fell to his knees right in front of me, the man who had yelled at and insulted me 2 hours ago. The man who had ordered me to serve his guests like a servant now knelt at my feet like a miserable beggar. Tears streamed down Mark's face. Snot ran from his nose, mixing with the tears, making his face look extremely disgusting. He began to sob and beg for forgiveness. He grabbed the hem of my dress, trying to kiss my feet. He said he had lost his mind, that the stress of work was so great he had sought an escape. He said he could swear to God he still loved me. He begged me to remember the beautiful memories of our courtship, the sweet beginnings of our marriage. He begged me to forgive him and withdraw President Harrison's complaint for the sake of our love, for our sacred marriage vows. He even promised to change, to be a good husband, to pray a lot, to do anything if I gave him a second chance. Hearing those cheap flatteries and stale promises, I felt nauseous. Perhaps the old me, the foolish woman who always believed he could change, would have softened at the sight of his tears. But my mother's death and today's events had killed that old Sarah. I looked at Mark with an empty, emotionless gaze. I remembered Mark's reaction when I returned from the funeral and was crying. That sentence echoed clearly in my ears. What good is crying going to do? Your mother isn't going to come back to life. That sentence was now a boomerang coming back to hit him. I took a step back, freeing my dress from his dirty hand. I looked down at him with a calm but piercing voice. I returned his own words to him. I asked, "Why are you crying, Mark?" I said, "There's no use in crying now. Your tears aren't going to restore the broken trust. Your tears aren't going to revive the respect I had for you." I told him to stop the drama, that it wasn't going to change any decision. I told him his tears were fake, that he was crying for losing his assets and position, not for being sorry for hurting my mother and me. President Harrison, standing beside me like a protector, finally delivered the final sentence. In a voice loud enough for all the remaining guests to hear, President Harrison pronounced the words of dismissal. He declared that from that moment on, Mark was fired from the company in disgrace. He also stressed that the company's legal team would immediately proceed with a criminal complaint for the embezzlement and fraud Mark had committed. Mark not only lost his job, but he would be blacklisted throughout the industry. His name would be tarnished, and no company would ever hire him again. Mark's ruin was completed when his cell phone in his pants pocket began to ring loudly. It wasn't the ring of a normal call, but the sound of an avalanche of message notifications. Mark took out the phone with trembling hands. His face turned even paler as he read the screen. They were threatening messages from online loan sharks. To finance his lavish lifestyle and please Jessica, Mark had gone into debt with several illegal loan apps. He had borrowed money at sky-high interest rates, relying on his large salary and promotion bonus to pay the installments. But now his source of income was completely cut off. He had no salary, no bonus, no severance pay due to his dishonorable discharge. Those collectors seemed to have a sixth sense. They attacked exactly when Mark had fallen to his lowest point. The phone kept ringing. Calls from unknown numbers started pouring in. Mark panicked. He threw the phone to the ground, smashing it as if to silence the bitter reality that was haunting him. But breaking the phone wouldn't make the problem go away. The debt was real, and now he had to face it alone without a cent in his pocket. Mark's colleagues, witnessing the complete destruction of their former boss, began to leave one by one. They no longer wanted anything to do with him. They looked at him with disgust and contempt. Some even spat on the floor as they passed him, a sign of disdain for his immoral attitude towards his wife and mother-in-law. The guests left without saying goodbye to Mark. They only nodded respectfully to me and President Harrison before hastily exiting the house, which now felt like hell for Mark. Mark was alone, truly alone, in the middle of the messy living room. Jessica was being held by a bodyguard in a corner of the room, too busy lamenting her own fate to worry about him. I no longer felt small, but stood tall with pride. I felt strong. I had seen the villain of my life crumble due to his own actions. Karma had arrived quickly, instantly, and painfully. I looked at Mark one last time, and then turned my back on him. I walked to my mother's photo, which still hung on the wall. I caressed the frame, whispering in my heart that justice had been done. There was nothing left that could harm us. But Mark's punishment was not yet over. President Harrison signaled to his head of security. It was time to take out the trash from this house. Mark no longer had the right to be here. This house was mine, inherited from my mother, and I did not want to share the same roof with the man who had desecrated our sacred marriage. The eviction was about to happen, and Mark was going to feel what it was like to be discarded like a useless piece of junk. Just as he had wanted to discard the memory of my mother from this house that very morning, the sky outside began to darken with gathering storm clouds, as if nature itself was ready to greet Mark with a cold storm, as cold as the fate that awaited him on the street. The sky outside had turned a leaden gray, as if the universe were echoing the tension in our living room. The echo of President Harrison's voice firing Mark still reverberated off the walls, creating an atmosphere that was suffocating, yet for me, liberating. The last of the guests had hastily departed, heads bowed, leaving only Mark and Jessica, cornered like rats discovered in a granary. I stood tall beside Mr. Harrison, watching with an empty gaze as Mark remained kneeling on the floor. His shattered cell phone lay beside his knee, a dead object that was a silent testament to his financial ruin. But the social and economic punishment was not enough. There was one matter left to resolve, one final possession that had to be stripped from him for my victory to be absolute and complete. It was this house, the house Mark had proclaimed as his palace, the place where he had acted like a king with absolute power over my mother and me. With the last shreds of courage he could muster from the rubble of his shattered pride, Mark tried to stand. His legs trembled, but he forced himself to look at me. His eyes were red, swollen, and revealed absolute panic. He knew he had lost his job. He knew he had lost his reputation, but he still believed he had a place to stay. In a hoarse voice that tried to sound firm, Mark pointed to the exit and yelled at me. He was kicking me out. He said that if I really wanted to break up with him and side with Mr. Harrison, I had to leave his house. Mark loudly proclaimed that this house was the fruit of his labor, his home, for which he paid the mortgage every month, and that I had no right to stay if I didn't obey him. He yelled that I could keep all of my mother's inheritance, but this house was his. I looked at him with profound pity. How pathetic was the man before me. He had lived so long in the fantasy he had created for himself that he had forgotten what was real and what was a lie. I didn't respond to his shouts. I simply turned slowly towards Mr. Harrison, signaling that it was time to play the final card. Mr. Harrison nodded understandingly. He once again took a folder from his secretary's briefcase, this one dark blue, different from the one with the will. Mr. Harrison tossed the folder onto the table in front of Mark. The folder slid smoothly and stopped right in front of a panting Mark. Mr. Harrison ordered Mark to open the folder and read it carefully before daring to kick out the rightful owner. Mark's hands trembled violently as he took the folder. He opened it abruptly, nearly tearing the papers inside. His eyes scanned the written lines. It was the property deed for the land and building of this house, and on it, the name of the legal owner was clearly listed. Eleanor Vance, my mother's name, not Mark's. Mark's eyes widened, and his mouth fell open in disbelief. He flipped through the pages of the deed, searching for his name, for any proof of his ownership, but it was in vain. His name appeared nowhere. I stepped forward and approached Mark. My voice was calm, but it cut into his conscience. I explained the truth my mother had hidden all this time to protect her son-in-law's pride. I told him that the mortgage money he gave me each month was laughably small for paying off such a large house in this upscale neighborhood. The money he gave me barely covered our daily food expenses if my mother hadn't secretly supplemented it. This house had been bought by my mother 10 years ago, long before I married Mark, paid for entirely in cash. My mother had let Mark feel like he was the owner of the house. She had let him boast about the renovations, even though the cost of changing the wallpaper had been reimbursed by my mother through the expense money, just so Mark could feel like a respected head of the family. But today, because Mark had trampled on my mother's honor, the truth had to come out. Mark shook his head violently, refusing to believe it. He screamed hysterically that it was impossible, that he had invested a lot of money in this house, but his shouts were useless. The legal proof was right before his eyes. He was nothing but a freeloader who didn't know his place. He had lived in the house of the mother-in-law he insulted. He had eaten with the money of the mother-in-law he belittled, and now he was trying to kick out the owner's own daughter. Mr. Harrison looked at Mark with manifest disgust. He said in a booming voice that Mark didn't have a single inch of right to this land, and since Mrs. Vance had bequeathed all her assets to me, the sole owner of this house was now me. With absolute power in my hands, I pointed to the front door, which was wide open. The night wind was beginning to bring a gust of cold air, as if signaling to take out the trash quickly. I said the word I had wanted to say for so long: "Get out." The word left my mouth lightly, but with a devastating weight for Mark. I didn't shout. I spoke with the firmness of a queen giving an order in her own domain. I told Mark and Jessica to get out of my house immediately. I never wanted to see their faces again. I didn't want the air of the house my mother had left me to be further contaminated by their breath. Mark tried to resist. He stood up and tried to grab my hand, perhaps to plead or to threaten, I don't know. But before his dirty fingers could touch my skin, Mr. Harrison's 2 bodyguards moved swiftly, grabbing both his arms, twisting them behind his back, and restraining him forcefully. Mark thrashed like a madman, shouting and insulting me, calling me an ungrateful wife, but his screams only sounded like the barking of a trapped dog. The bodyguards dragged Mark by force towards the exit. Mark's shoes squeaked as they scraped against the tile floor that I had mopped with tears that very afternoon. This time, that floor was a silent witness to the expulsion of the parasite that had been eating away at my happiness. Seeing Mark being dragged away, Jessica tried to take the opportunity to slip away, but I wouldn't let her escape so easily. I called her name loudly. Jessica froze, her body tensed. I ordered the bodyguard to make sure Jessica also went out the door of my house, and that she took nothing but the clothes on her back. The handbag, phone, and jewelry bought with fraudulent money had already been confiscated. Jessica looked at me with pleading eyes, but I turned away. She had to feel what it was like to have nothing, just as she had tried to trample on my dignity earlier. Mark and Jessica were pushed out the front door, stumbling onto the front yard. The sky, which had been holding back, finally broke. The rain began to pour down in sheets, not a drizzle, but a deluge that soaked them in an instant. The rainwater mixed with Mark's tears. He got up, drenched. His hair, once neatly styled, now hung limply over his forehead. He ran back to the porch, banging on the glass door that the bodyguards had locked from the inside. He screamed my name, begging for forgiveness, saying he had nowhere to go. He said his wallet was left inside, and he didn't have a single dollar in his pocket because I had told the bodyguard not to give it to him. I stood behind the large living room window, watching the scene outside with an empty heart. The porch light illuminated Mark's pathetic figure. He pounded on the glass, his face pressed against it, distorted by the streams of rain. He looked like a ghost from the past, trying to haunt me, but this glass now separated us. Behind Mark, Jessica stood shivering from the cold. Her mascara had run, staining her cheeks and making her look like a weeping clown. Mark turned to Jessica, hoping his mistress could help him. He asked her to take him in her car, to let him sleep at her place, but the drama in the yard was not yet over. Jessica, realizing that Mark was now a useless beggar who had also dragged her into legal trouble, flatly refused in the pouring rain. Jessica's screams could be heard as she pushed Mark, causing him to fall into a mud puddle. Jessica yelled that all this misfortune was Mark's fault. She called him a man of bad luck, a scammer, an idiot. The couple, who had been feeding each other cake in my party, now pushed and insulted each other in the mud of my yard. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to come out onto their porches. They watched the free show with mocking glances. Mark's reputation in this neighborhood had completely collapsed. Now everyone knew his true face. Finally, ashamed of being seen by the neighbors and chilled to the bone, Jessica ran off in the rain, leaving my yard without a backward glance at Mark. She left him alone, lying in the mud. Mark tried to follow her but slipped. He fell and got up, stumbling towards the gate that had opened automatically. Mr. Harrison's bodyguard, after making sure Mark had crossed the threshold of the gate, pressed a button on the remote. The sturdy, tall iron gate closed slowly, forever separating my world from Mark's. Mark was left outside the gate, clinging to the cold bars, looking at this house that now shone warm and bright. He realized that the gates of the paradise he had been living in had closed forever, and now he had to face the earthly hell he had created for himself. I turned and walked away from the window. I didn't want to see him again. I took a deep breath, inhaling the air of the room that now felt more spacious, though still messy. Mr. Harrison gave me a gentle pat on the shoulder and a paternal, encouraging smile. That night, with the sound of rain hitting the roof, I felt truly alone, but not helpless. I felt free. This house was my mother's and mine again. 1 month had passed since that stormy night. Time had flown, bringing drastic changes to my life. This morning, the sun streamed brightly through my bedroom curtains, greeting a new day with a different kind of warmth. There were no more of Mark's shouts rushing me to make breakfast. There was no more fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. The large house my mother had left me now felt silent and peaceful. I woke up with a light heart, said my morning prayers, and prayed for my mother's soul to rest in peace. Then I got ready to go, not to the kitchen or the market, but to the company headquarters. I stood in front of the large mirror in my room. My reflection had changed. My face, once dull and always tired from mental pressure, now looked fresh and radiant. My eyes, once swollen from tears, now emanated determination and intelligence. I wore a professional, elegant suit, without excessive frills, but which exuded an aura of authority. I adjusted my scarf slightly, making sure everything was perfect. Today was an important day. An extraordinary general meeting of shareholders would be held, and I, Sarah, would take the place my mother should have occupied. The company car was waiting for me at the entrance of the house. A personal chauffeur opened the door for me courteously. During the drive to the financial district, I watched the city's skyscrapers. I used to be just the wife of an ordinary employee who knew nothing of this world. Now I was the owner of one of the tallest buildings in the city. Upon arriving at the office, the welcome I received was extraordinary. From the receptionist to the department heads, employees gave a respectful nod as I walked through the lobby. I heard whispers of admiration. They knew who I was. They knew I was the daughter of the company's founder, the woman who had uncovered the corruption scandal of a former director and brought a breath of fresh air. I entered the boardroom. The room was large, cool, and dominated by a long, oval mahogany table. Around the table sat elderly directors and auditors with decades of experience. I would never have even imagined entering this room before, but today I walked in with my head held high. President Harrison stood to greet me and invited me to sit at the head of the table, the seat that had been empty, my mother's seat. When I sat down, everyone fell silent, awaiting my instructions. With a calm but firm voice, I began the meeting. I discussed the company's new vision, fairer employee welfare policies, and the eradication of the corrupt practices that had proliferated under the previous management. I spoke not just as an heiress, but as someone who understood the values of hard work and honesty that my mother had instilled in me. While I was presiding over a meeting in a cool skyscraper, Mark was living a very different fate. In a squalid, overcrowded corner of the city, in a damp and narrow 10x 10-foot boarding house room, Mark lay curled up on a thin foam mattress that smelled of mildew. The ceiling of his room leaked, and water from the previous night's rain dripped onto the already cracked tile floor. There was no air conditioning, only a small, dusty, and noisy fan. Mark was awakened by loud banging on the door. His heart leaped. It wasn't a visitor, it was the debt collectors. Since being fired and kicked out, Mark's life had completely fallen apart. His name was blacklisted in the industry. No company wanted to hire him after the embezzlement and immorality scandal spread. He tried to get a job as a rideshare driver, but his account was rejected for having a criminal record under police investigation. His savings were nil, his credit cards were blocked, his friends avoided him like the plague. Even the woman he once adored, Jessica, was now a witness for the prosecution, testifying against him to get a reduced sentence. Mark was truly alone. The banging on the door grew louder, accompanied by rude shouts demanding payment. Mark covered his ears with the pillow, trembling with fear. His stomach ached. He hadn't eaten anything since lunch yesterday. He only ate raw instant noodles because the gas for his portable stove had run out, and he had no money to buy a new canister. His face, once neat and arrogant, was now gaunt, covered by a scruffy beard, and his eyes were sunken in terrible dark circles. He looked at the news on social media on the screen of a cheap, cracked phone. There was a photo of me next to President Harrison launching a company's social responsibility project. I was smiling elegantly, Mark cried. Tears of belated regret soaked the old pillow. He remembered again the comfortable house, the delicious food, and the wife who had served him with all her heart. He had thrown it all away for a momentary pleasure, and now he had to pay the price with a life of suffering. Back in my life, after the meeting and signing some important documents, I asked the chauffeur to take me to the place I most wanted to go, Oak Ridge Cemetery. The evening sky was a reddish-orange color. As I entered the cemetery grounds, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the plane trees. I walked to my mother's grave. The grave was now well tended. The grass was beginning to grow green, and her name was beautifully engraved on the black marble headstone. I knelt beside my mother's headstone and placed a basket of fresh, fragrant jasmine flowers, her favorite. I gently caressed my mother's name engraved on the stone. There were no more tears of pain constricting my chest as there were a month ago, only a warm longing and deep gratitude. I began to speak as if my mother were sitting next to me. I told her about today's meeting, about President Harrison who had helped me so much, and about how I was beginning to rebuild my life. I also whispered softly that justice had been done, that the person who had hurt us had paid the price, and that for my own peace of mind, I had forgiven that past. "Mom," I whispered softly, my voice carried by the evening wind. "I'm not crying anymore. I'm strong now. You don't have to worry anymore. The legacy of courage you gave me is far more valuable than all this wealth." I closed my eyes for a moment and felt my mother's presence in the breeze that caressed my face. It was like her last warm hug. I felt as if a heavy burden had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I opened my eyes and smiled sweetly at the headstone. I stood up and lightly brushed the dust off my clothes. The sun was beginning to set on the western horizon, but for me, it was not the end of the day. It was the new dawn of my life. I turned and walked away from the cemetery with firm, confident steps. At the cemetery gate, my car was waiting. I got in, ready to face a bright future, a future where I was not an extra in someone else's drama, but the protagonist of my own story. The story of tears over a party was over, closed with the golden ink of victory and justice.